Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann and welcome to this tutorial on simulating burning cloth in Blender. This week marks 8 months since my first YouTube tutorial, which was this burning paper effect, and I have since simplified the process and thought that it would be a lot of fun to add the cloth simulation as well. So with that being said, let's begin. I'll start by deleting my default cube and adding a plane. And then in edit mode, rotate it on X 90 degrees. And scale it on X so that it's about 4 Blender units wide. And then I'll add some loop cuts, because when I subdivide it, I want it to be in nice even squares. So then subdivide and change the number of cuts to 25. And now, because we'll be using dynamic paint, it's really important to set up your material and unwrap your object first. And in my case, I've created a fictional flag to use as my texture, but whatever texture you are using, you'll just want to make sure that it's unwrapped. Because in our dynamic paint settings, we'll be using image sequence rather than the default vertex setting, so it uses the object's UVs. Now I'll add a cube, and I'll scale it in so that it's really thin and a little taller than the flag or the canvas. And I'll add several loop cuts. Then select some of those loops and use proportional editing to bend the brush, because as this moves across the canvas, it would look a little unnatural if it was too straight. So I want it to burn a little unevenly. Now I can subdivide the brush and take the cuts up to 5, and then take the fractal up pretty high, because this will make the edges jagged, which is important for creating a realistic, burning edge. So now I can insert some keyframes. And at frame 1, I'll insert one at the beginning of the flag. And in my case, I'll have 400 frames. So at 400, I'll move the brush to the middle of the canvas, and I'll insert another keyframe. So by bending the brush, that helps a little, but it's still burning at an even speed across the canvas. And so a way to fix that is if I go to my object data, I can add a new shape key. So I'll add the basis, and I'll click the plus sign again to add my first shape key. Then in edit mode, I'll basically just invert the direction that these bends are facing. So I'll move this one forward, and then these two I'll move back. And now if I just add a few keyframes into that shape key, it'll look like it's burning at different speeds across the whole length of the flag. Right, so now it looks like the middle is burning maybe a little faster than the rest of it, which is good. Then with the brush selected, all I need to do is change the color to black. Then I'll select the canvas and switch this from vertex to image sequence. Double the resolution to 512. Select the UV map. And under Dynamic Paint Output, rather than sending those images to the temp folder, I've created folders on my desktop. So the very first Dynamic Paint that we'll be doing is for Alpha, so I've selected my folder named Alpha, and I'm just going to bake that image sequence. Now I can start working on the flag's material. So first I'm going to add a translucent shader and mix it with an add shader. And that isn't at all necessary to set up the dynamic paint, but it is a thin cloth flag, so it would likely be translucent. So now I'll mix that add shader with a transparent shader, and I'll duplicate this image texture. Now I'll open the folder that I just baked the image sequence to and select the first image, and then change this from single image to image sequence, and the number of frames to, in my case, 400. and then check auto refresh. And now I can use the alpha as the factor of the mix shader. And so that's working. And you can also see, because we use that fractal setting when we subdivided the brush, this line is really jagged. So again, it really helps with the effect. But it still looks a little too clean, the edge. So we're going to do another image sequence so that we can make a black charred effect around that jagged edge. So select your brush and then go back to your dynamic paint settings and switch it from mesh volume to proximity. And then the only thing you need to do in your canvas settings is just switch the output to a different folder and bake that image sequence as well. So once that's done, I'll just duplicate this texture. And I can just open up the first image of the image sequence that I just baked out. And set this up the same way as last time, just 400 frames, and make sure that auto refresh is checked. Then I can mix this with the flag texture and use the alpha as the factor. And that looks pretty good, but it's a little dark, so I will set this from mix to overlay, and that's a little softer. You may also see some of your texture on the edge that should be transparent, and if that's the case, you can just scale your UVs in slightly. That oftentimes does happen with dynamic paint using the image sequence. Alright, so the next step is to make this edge look like it's hot and that it's glowing. So we can do that. Just select the brush, and then in your dynamic paint settings, switch it back to mesh volume. And you'll need to scale this. In my case, I'm going to scale it on X and Y only so that it's a little thicker. And now in the canvas settings, the only thing you'll need to do is switch the output folder. And so once you've done that, just bake that image sequence. Okay, so then back to the material. And I'll add an emission shader. And I'll mix it with the add shader that is combining the diffuse and the translucent shader. Now I'll add a mix RGB node and set the colors to something like a bright red and then an orangish yellow, and take the strength up. Now duplicate a texture node. And once again, open up the first image from that file and set this up the same way. Image sequence, frames 400, make sure that auto refresh is checked, and then use the alpha as the factor of that mix shader. And it looks okay, but we need to break up the color of that emission, so I'm just going to use a Voronoi texture as the factor of this mix RGB node. And then of course just adjust the scaling to your liking, and that's starting to look a little better. But there's still some more that we can do to make it a little more realistic. So I'll add a diffuse shader and set the color to black, because I want to make this edge look like it's burning with varied intensity. So some areas will be lighter than others. So I'll mix the diffuse and the emission shader together. And then I'll add a noise texture, and that will be the factor of those two shaders. And also drop a color ramp in and move the white value back, which sharpens up that noise texture. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I can, tweak the intensity of the emission and the scaling of some of those procedural textures to get it more to, my liking, but that's looking pretty good. And so there's one last thing to do with Dynamic Paint. But the settings are a little different, so we'll need to go back into our canvas settings and switch it from image sequence back to vertex, and change the surface type from paint to weight. And next I'll check anti-aliasing and fade and change the time all the way down to 1. And what that does, I can show you by making my brush transparent. Now, as soon as it puts the weight down on the canvas, it's going to immediately disappear and it won't leave any traces behind it. Now I'm going to select parts of my brush and delete them because I don't want the whole edge of the flag to be on fire, just some parts, especially after setting up that intricate material. We want some of that edge to be shown so that you can see the effect. So now in this case, there will just be a flame at the top and the bottom. And once that is done, you want to select your canvas and go back to your Dynamic Paint settings. And next to Dynamic Paint Output, you want to click this little plus, which adds that to your vertex groups. And now we're finished with the brush, so you could delete it or move it to another layer. And I'll tab into edit mode and select this edge and add a new vertex group, and this one I'll call pin, and this will be for the cloth simulation. So now I'll go to my physics and click on cloth. And there isn't too much to do here in the settings. I will use the preset of silk, and then check pinning and select that vertex group. Set the frames to however long your animation is. And then in cloth collision, I'm going to check self collision and take the quality up a little. And so that this behaves like a flag, I'm going to add a force field of wind. And I'll just rotate it. And I'm going to take the strength up very high to something like 4,000. Okay, so I'm pleased with how that looks, and the Dynamic Paint is working as well. So I can just bake this cloth simulation. And it helps add smooth shading to the plane, of course. And so now I'm ready to start adding the fire simulation. So I'll just press the space bar and start to type quick and then choose quick smoke. That adds the domain. And I can just scale up the domain and move it to the side so that there's plenty of room for the fire simulation. So change my flow type to fire. And I'll take the flame rate down because the wind's going to be blowing that flame out pretty high. And under the vertex group, I'll select that DP weight. And these subframes, it improves the quality of fast-moving flames, so I'll just increase that to 1. And in the domain settings, I'll just check Smoke Adaptive Domain and Smoke High Resolution, and change the number of frames to 400. And now I'll double the resolution. And if you're pleased with how that looks, then go ahead and save and then bake your fire simulation. And I won't be going over the process for giving the fire a material. That would make this tutorial too lengthy. But I'm sure many of you know how, and if you don't, there are plenty of tutorials online. And now in GIMP, I'll add a new image, and I'll make it 512 by 512. And the background will be transparent. And I'll select this brush, which is this dynamically changing sort of scratchy brush. which works really well because what we're going to be doing is creating ashes, and these will be the particle system. So I'm just giving this a really random shape. Now I'll create a new layer and I'll fill it with black and take the opacity down so I can see the image below. And I'll set my brush color to white. And I'll just start tracing around the edge. Not the edge of the whole image, but just in certain areas. Then take the opacity up, and then I'll just save both of these images out separately to my desktop. Now back in Blender, I'll go to a new layer and add a plane, and in edit mode type Alt-P to add a vertex in the center, and I'll just move this down to give the plane some shape and then smooth shade it. Then I'll give it a material, and I'll add that first texture that I made. And of course mix it with a transparent shader and use the alpha from the texture as the mix factor. So that's the ash, but I want there to be a little bit of a glowing edge. So I'll add an emission shader and mix it. And then the mix factor will be the second texture from GIMP. And the rest of it's pretty self-explanatory. You would just want to give the emission some color. In my case, I used a mix RGB node, and I've separated that with a Voronoi texture. And I've also used a particle info node, and that allows the color of the emission to get darker as it moves further away from the emitter. I've repeated that process a few times so that I have some variation in those ashes. So now I'll select all of these and type Ctrl-G and make them a group. And I'll just name that group ashes. And here I hit a little bit of a roadblock because my first attempt at this, I selected the flag and I created a new particle system, and I just selected that group and then thought that I could just under vertex groups select the DP weight, which is the vertex group that the fire is emitting from. But what happens is all those particles for some reason shoot out of the corner, and I'm not exactly sure why. So if somebody does know why, I would love an explanation. But I did find a way around it. So I'll just delete that particle system. Then I'll add a plane and I'll rotate it on Y so that the top of it is facing the direction in which I want the particles emitting from. And I'll move the plane out in front of the flag. I'm also going to scale it on Y so that it's thinner. Now with that plane selected, I'll shift select the flag and I'll just tab into edit mode and select one vertex and then hit Ctrl-P and make a vertex parent. Now if I play that animation, that plane will follow along, but it will keep its own rotation. And now I can give this plane the same keyframes I gave the brush in the dynamic paint settings, and it should keep up with the fire. And now we can work on the particle system. I'm going to take the end frame all the way up to 400 and take the number of particles all the way down to 50. Then I'll select that group. And under field weights, I want to take the gravity all the way down and also the effects of the wind. Because right now the wind strength is all the way up to 4,000, which would just blow those particles off the screen too fast. So instead I'll just go up to the velocity and take it in a negative x direction, just so that it's pushing them in that direction, and you have a little more control over the actual speed. I think I want them to go a little faster, so I'll just move this in the negative x direction a little more. And the size I'll take up a little bit, and then take the random size all the way up. Now I'll check this little rotation box, and I'll move the rotation up to about a 0.5, and that means many of the particles will begin at a random rotation. And then if I check this little dynamic box, then instead of each particle sort of keeping its rotation, they'll all sort of have their individual orientations, and they'll all rotate independently, which looks pretty good for simulating something like ash. Now I'll just take the lifetime up a little and maybe give it a little bit of random lifetime as well. And then take the Brownian up really high, because that will add some sort of like chaotic motion to those ashes. But that's looking pretty good. You also want to make sure that you're not rendering the emitter, so you'll just want to uncheck that box. And then for the emission that we set up for our dynamic paint, I like to put some keyframes in at the start and the end. And then in the graph editor, you can see this pink line which represents the animation. So if you go to Key and then add F-curve modifier and select Noise, now that animation will jump back and forth between those two keyframe values. And I'll do the same step for the ashes as well. And this is supposed to simulate what's happening when there's a burning amber and there's a difference in intensity of the wind. It will, of course, strengthen or weaken the intensity of the glowing ambers. So, but that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial, and I'll see you next time.